Growing up, my mother had always told me and my siblings about a ghost that she swore followed her around. She would always describe seeing this elderly-looking man who was always dressed up in a sharp suit, and she said that any time she would see him, something unlucky would happen. Now, even as a child, I thought these stories were nothing more than a hoax, or her imagination, and I never really believed her. That is until I saw the man for myself, and oddly enough, my mother was nowhere around. The incident occurred shortly after my fiance and I moved into a new home together that we could afford. We had been living there for a few months, and everything was going really well, aside for a few issues that we had with electrical outlets in the kitchen. Other than that though, we couldn't have loved the house anymore. However, things changed on the day that I decided to finish putting away the rest of the boxes. My fiance was in the bathroom at the time, so I was working by myself, but I really wish she had been there to see it. I was picking up the last box that I was going to be taking to storage. As I turned to walk down the hallway, that was when I saw him. Standing in the middle of the hallway, facing the bedroom in the other direction, was a well-dressed, pale, elderly man. I took a step back from the shock, but I calmed myself down. Honestly, at the moment I didn't even think about the stories my mother had told me. I simply thought there was an intruder in our home. I called for my fiance and told her to stay in the bathroom, and I began walking toward the intruder who had made his way into the bedroom after I began yelling for my fiance. But when I got into the bedroom, no one was there. My fiance ended up running out of the bathroom and down the hall to me to see what had happened. But after I told her, she thought I was trying to scare her. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, after looking around and finding absolutely no sign of anyone in the room. But I couldn't shake that feeling, like something was wrong. That night, it was hard to go to sleep, but eventually, I was able to pass out for a little while. However, after a little while of being asleep, I was woken up by something. I don't know if it was a noise or what, but something woke me up, and right away, I felt uneasy. It felt like someone was staring at me, which caused me to slowly lift my head and look over to the door of our bedroom. I let out a loud scream that ended up waking up my fiance. She jumped up from her slumber and looked at the direction that I was staring, and to my surprise, she saw exactly what I was seeing. Standing just inside our bedroom door was the same old man I had seen before, only this time, he was looking right at me and pointing in my direction. I sat up quickly and got ready to confront the intruder, but right before both of our eyes, the elderly man seemed to vanish into darkness. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. That was when we smelled it. My fiance and I both looked at each other as we began sniffing the air, and right away we both recognized the smell of smoke. We hopped out of bed and ran into the living room and kitchen area, where we saw the source of the smell. A fire had broken out in our kitchen, and by the time we noticed it, it was far too strong for us to put it out. My fiance and I ran from our home and called the fire department. Sadly, there wasn't much they could do for us aside from putting out the fire. By the time the fire was out, the house was essentially destroyed. To this day, neither of us is sure whether the old man was meaning to warn us about the fire or if he was the one who started it. All I know is there is a lot that can't be explained by logic. Moving into a new house is always a bittersweet feeling. As nice as it is to finally get a place of your own, it's a bit unnerving when you are by yourself for the first couple of nights, especially when you come from a large family like mine. But when I was 23 years old, I had finally been promoted to a position at work where I had been earning enough money to get a lease on a small, one-bedroom home about 40 minutes away from where I used to live. The house was small, but I loved it. I didn't have any neighbors, and my property was surrounded by woods and trees. And on top of that, I finally lived by myself. It was just freeing in a way. However, on my third night living in the home, I began noticing things that I still can't quite understand. The first instance occurred while I was cooking dinner for myself that night. I had just finished cooking pasta, and I was straining it in the kitchen sink when I noticed something moving out in the yard. I looked up from the sink and out of my kitchen window, which had been facing the backyard, and on the other side of the yard, the section closest to the woods, I noticed something moving around. I tried to get a look at it, but the lighting wasn't too great, and honestly, the only reason I think I noticed it was because it was moving around. It was simply too dark to make out exactly what it was. And I'll admit that at first, I was a bit worried, but I quickly brushed the incident off and just assumed that I had seen a deer or something walking around in the freshly fallen snow. That night, after dinner, I watched some TV and checked my email before getting ready for bed. As I was getting ready to lay down and go to bed, I stopped myself as I began hearing what I thought was walking outside. I couldn't be sure at first, but it sounded like I could hear snow crunching underneath someone or something's footsteps. I went over to the window and peeked out, expecting to see an animal, but to my surprise, there was nothing there. It took me a little while after hearing those noises, but eventually I was able to fall asleep. The next morning, I got out of bed and began getting ready for work, and when I walked outside to my car, I immediately began looking down at the snow to see what sort of tracks I could find. I couldn't quite tell what sort of animal they belonged to because there had been a small layer of fresh snow on top of them, but I did find footprints that seemed pretty large. I tried to tell myself that it was most likely a bear or something, but there was something in my gut telling me that I was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling the rest of the day that there was something off about my new home, but I did my best to silence any of those sort of thoughts and went about my business. That evening, I did my usual routine, and this time I didn't see anything outside while I was cooking my dinner. Sadly, I can't say the same for when I was cleaning up. You see, I had been doing the dishes when once again, I could have sworn that I saw something moving outside, and this time I wanted to get a better look at the animal, so I walked over to my back door and opened it to look outside. But when I got there, I couldn't find anything. There was no signs of movement or anything of that sort. I was confused, but ended up shrugging it off and closing the door as I made my way back to the kitchen sink. After I began working on the dishes again, I couldn't help but feel like something was staring at me. I looked up from the plate that I was rinsing off and fell backward in shock from what I had seen. As soon as I looked through the glass of the window, I could see, staring back at me from no more than a half foot away from the window, were a pair of glowing orange eyes. As I fell backward, I kept my eyes glued to the window, and that was when I noticed the large snout and mouth full of a dozen razor-sharp fangs. I closed my eyes for a split second when I hit the ground, and by the time I looked back at the window, there was nothing there. As fast as I could, I stood up and ran to the back door to ensure that I locked it, and right after that I did the same to the front. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it couldn't have been good. For the next couple of hours, I did my best to be as quiet as possible and just listen to what was going on around me. I could swear that throughout the night, I could hear the sounds of something walking around my house through the heavy layer of snow that lined the ground. But the worst part of it was when I was laying in my room, just hoping to get even an ounce of sleep. Somehow, I swear it knew where I was laying because right behind my head, through the wall leading to the outside, I heard the sound of something scratching. As soon as that happened, I sprang up and ran into my living room, where I ended up staying until the sun came up. That morning, I very warily made my way outside and began inspecting the sound that I had been hearing. And just as I had suspected, there were footsteps going all around my house in multiple rows from each cycle that they made. But what really terrified me were the claw marks that had been running along the entire backside of my house. I tried to call the police, but at the end of the day, they didn't have any answers for me, and they just told me to call them if something happened again. Oddly enough though, nothing ever ended up happening after that. It was like whatever it was had just disappeared and given up on harassing me. Almost everybody by now knows the story behind Skinwalker Ranch, and most people know that being found trespassing on the property can have serious consequences. You can either get lucky and simply be escorted off the property, or if you do something terrible, you can even see possible jail time. In my case, I was simply walking around, so I was lucky enough to just be escorted off the property. But what made it even luckier is that the security that caught me most likely saved my life. It was the middle of August, and I had just purchased a motel room near Skinwalker Ranch and decided that I would sneak onto the property to see if I could witness anything that was paranormal. And to be honest, it wasn't super hard to get onto the property. It's so big that they can't monitor it all at one time. That being said, as soon as you are on the property, they will know you're there. They have a bunch of alarms and cameras, so it's only a matter of time until you're caught. I knew that, so as soon as I got onto the property, I began exploring. It was the middle of the night, and I could hardly see anything that was in front of me. At first, nothing was happening, and honestly, I was feeling a little bit let down. But right as I was getting that feeling, I noticed something really odd coming from the ridge in front of me. It was as if the mountain range itself was giving off light. It was very mesmerizing, but the light only lasted for about 2 minutes, and once it was gone, my eyes had to readjust to the darkness around me. Before I could catch my bearings, I felt my heart drop from my chest as I began hearing noises coming from my left and my right. It sounded like something was rustling around in the bush on either side of me, so I did my best to look around but couldn't see anything. I began taking deep breaths and just doing everything I could to focus, and eventually I was able to calm down. Too bad for me, the peace only lasted about a second. As I was standing there, I began looking out in front of me, and I couldn't quite tell, but I could swear that I was seeing something in the field ahead of me. I couldn't make it out, but something was hunched over about 30 feet in front of me, and it looked almost human. I did my best not to move and hoped that it wouldn't notice me, but I wasn't so lucky. After staring at it for a second, its head quickly cocked to the side and looked directly at me. To my horror, it began turning toward my direction, and slowly it looked as it was almost crawling toward me on all fours. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. I couldn't move for the life of me. Thankfully, before it got too close to me, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance and began yelling. It only took a few more seconds for the security to get to my location and pick me up. I got in trouble for trespassing, and the group warned me that if I was found on the property again, they would be pressing charges, which I was fine with because there was no way I was going back there. But what really freaked me out was as we were leaving, I was explaining to one of the staff members about what I had seen, and they told me that I was lucky the security got there. If it hadn't, I likely would have died.